Hello, Tanse, Atlanite, Ani, Bonjour. Welcome back to our shared politics. My name is Nova, and I am a settler on Turtle Island. I created this podcast with the hope of highlighting our similarities amongst political parties instead of focusing on the differences and pushing people further apart. I wish to express acknowledgement that I am on treaty territory, home to the Titsikane, Daneza, Nahiawak, Soto, and BC Métis. It is essential that I recognize all First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, both status and non-status, as the guardians of these lands. As a non-Indigenous person, I play a role as a treaty partner, being represented by the government. My pronouns are she, her, but I also accept they, them, and I fall under the 2S LGBTQIA plus umbrella. Last episode, we went over the initial attempted colonization of Canada in 1534, the fur trade and establishment of the Hudson's Bay Company in 1670, the opening of the first residential schools, and up to the signing of Canada's Confederation in 1867. Today, we will go over Post-Confederation Canada, from the transfer of the HBC Charter to the newly confederated Dominion, thus leading to the creation of the numbered treaties. This episode will consist of a timeline of 44 years of Canadian politics, only from 1867 to 1911, which encompasses the beginning of the federal residential school system up to Canada entering World War I very briefly introduced John A. Macdonald during the last episode, who was appointed the first Prime Minister of Canada, but I want to give you a little background knowledge on why he's in hell now. During his 76 years on this planet, he left a horrible legacy. He was a Conservative Party member and a known alcoholic. As Prime Minister, Little Johnny served a total of 19 years over 2 terms. The first term was from 1867 to 1873, and during those 6 years, he established the Northwest Mounted Police, a paramilitary force designed specifically to enable colonization in Indigenous lands, and expanded Canada by annexing the Northwestern Territory, Rupert's Land, British Columbia, and PEI. In 1869, he sent commissioners to London in order to negotiate the transfer of Rupert's Land and the Northwestern Territory to Canada. The Northwestern Territory covered what is now present-day Northwest Territories and Yukon, parts of Nunavut, and northern Alberta and Saskatchewan. If you think of Canada's map today, the border between the Northwestern Territory and Rupert's Land cut basically across the country from northeast Nunavut to southwest Alberta, since British Columbia was its own colony at the time. Hudson's Bay Company received £300,000 in compensation from Canada, which was a loan from the Crown, as well as retained some trading posts and 1/20th of the best farmland in Rupert's Land. This led to the first crisis the federal government faced. After the purchase, John A. Macdonald appointed an Anglophone governor who the Francophone, mostly Métis, inhabitants opposed. Before the land had been officially transferred to Canada, the governor had sent surveyors to plot the land in order to divide it up for colonial agriculture. Louis Riel, leading the Métis, prevented them from entering the territory in what was the beginning of the Red River Rebellion. Under the provisional government established by Louis Riel, Manitoba actually went on to become the 5th province to join Confederation on July 15, 1870, leaving the rest of the purchased lands to become the Northwest Territories. However, months before this happened, Louis Riel called for the execution of a federal government supporter and fled to the U.S. to escape prosecution. Even in exile, however, he was elected 3 times as a member of the House of Commons, but could never take a seat. After gaining Manitoba in the Confederation in 1870 and rights to the Northwest Territories, Old Macdonald set his sights on British Columbia. British Columbia had actually initially been a Spanish colony, but conceded its claims but Spain, I guess, conceded its claims in 1794. I didn't write that. After which a British presence was permanently in the region. In 1818, the U.S. and British fur traders were given co-occupancy of the land until 1846. In 1858, because of an influx of Americans during the gold rush, the colony of British Columbia was established. July 20th, 1871, BC became the sixth province to join Confederation. This was fueled by fears of annexation by the USA, overwhelming debt by the population growth, the need for social services to support said population, and the economic depression that had been caused by the end of the gold rush. Canada agreed to extend the not yet started Canadian Pacific Railway to BC and assume the colony's debt, which I read something when I was looking over all this. BC apparently didn't even had no hopes that Canada would ever assume the colony's debt, and they came to the table and was like, "Yeah, that's one of our negotiations," or what. And BC, of course, was like, "Awesome, we'll sign." In 1870, most of the herds of buffalo had been exterminated. This was in order to control the indigenous people across North America. A colonizer even noted in his journal in 1870 that, quote, slaughtering buffaloes was a government measure to subjugate the Indians, unquote. While a colonel in the U.S. Army summed up the spirits of the massacres with, quote, kill every buffalo you can. Every buffalo dead is an Indian gone, unquote. Before 1800, an estimated 30 to 60 million buffalo roamed the continent. By 1900, only a few hundred remained. This was one of many vulnerabilities that led to the signing of the treaties out of imposed desperation. On August 3rd, 1871, the first of the treaties, known today as Treaty 1, was signed between the Anishinaabe and Mushkegowuk nations in southern Manitoba and Crown representatives known as Indian agents. These accords were to be held on the understanding of gaining long-lasting peace and friendship with the settlers, as was already mostly well established with the traders. The indigenous people were okay with Europeans being on their land. They just didn't want settlers coming in and screwing up their way of life. After the 8 days of treaty making, it ended with the indigenous groups agreeing to cede, release, surrender, and yield up to Her Majesty the Queen and successors forever all the lands, in exchange for an annual annuity and material goods. However, it's now understood these treaties were signed under duress, and the indigenous peoples were lied to about what exactly was written in the contracts themselves. At the end of the signing, the indigenous peoples received limited reserve land, 160 acres per family of 5, which was the same amount of land a colonizer was given by the Crown to homestead. Abysmal monetary compensation, like an annual $15 a year for a family of 5, and education. Canada obtained all the land rights, a promise of peace and law and order, and agreed to prohibit the introduction of alcohol on reserves. By this time, Indigenous peoples obviously understood the impact of alcohol, but some trading posts, known as whiskey posts, would only trade furs for alcohol. This practice would finally become illegal on reservations. After the signing of Treaty 1, the Commissioner and Governor packed up and set off to complete Treaty 2. Treaty 2 was signed on behalf of the Anishinaabe peoples of that region on August 21st, 1871, and is surrounding Treaty 1 on the north and west borders. The terms were the same. Months after the treaties were signed, turmoil began. In the written text of the treaties, there were no provisions included for the agricultural implements, clothing, or animals that were promised towards the end of negotiations. These were all very important aspects of the agreements, as the European settlers who obtained land were at a much more financially ready stage to begin actual farming and could be expected to have the savings or the work experience and, most importantly, the fucking white privilege to gain the finances to buy their own tools. Indigenous people, however, had no access to farm tools and didn't have the privilege to gain them as quickly as a colonizer could. These unfulfilled terms became known as the outside promises. Even some colonizers at the time acknowledged the paradox in giving them in asking indigenous peoples to take up agricultural practices without giving them the tools to do so, and one witness to the Treaty 2 signing advised the government to resolve the situation. In the run-up to the first election in 1872, the Tories hadn't begun construction on the bi-coastal railway. Macdonald was losing votes, and the Grits, as the Liberals were known, did better than the Conservatives in Ontario, seeing the Tories' majority reduced. The negotiations were still dragging on between the government and financiers, before Macdonald granted the charter to a group in late 1872. In 1873, when Parliament opened, a Liberal MP charged that government ministers had been bribed with large contributions, with documents soon coming to light, which substantiated these claims. The financiers had donated $179,000. What is that even today? Actually, I should have looked that up. They had donated $179,000 in 1873. Is that what it was? They would have done it before that, but 179. Oh my gosh, 179,000. That is $4,723,000 today. So that had been donated to the Tory election funds, with Macdonald taking $45,000. Or over $1.1 million in today's money in contributions himself. A telegram dated August 1872 was leaked in a newspaper from Macdonald requesting another $10,000 and promising it will be the last time of asking. There's actually a couple really good political cartoons about this exact little thing that you can find that were like whatever written up, and it's like Macdonald with his hand out asking for more money. In 1873, PEI joined Confederation, becoming the 7th province of the Dominion of Canada. Treaty 3 was signed on October 3rd, 1873 by the Anishinaabe peoples, whose lands covered southeastern Manitoba into western Ontario. This surrounded the last edge of Treaty 1, thus enclosing it completely. The treaty had been in discussion since 1870 between the Indian agents and the Indigenous peoples, but a negotiation had never been reached. The Anishinaabe had no intention of allowing farmers to settle and instead wanted compensation in exchange for allowing the development of specific government projects on their land. I'm guessing this would be like the new bi-coastal railway. They requested $10 per man, woman, and child annually for as long as the sun shines, as well as rations of pork, tea, tobacco, and flour to be used in celebrations. The Indian agent found the request excessive, as did the governor, instead authorizing only $2.40 annually to each person. The Indigenous people did not sign. The next summer, 1871, the Indian agent went back and offered this new price, but the Anishinaabe refused, as they wanted payments for the right-of-way through their lands. In 1872, the Anishinaabe were now making new demands, having found silver and gold. With the National Railway on the line, the government agreed to give the agents the ability to offer a maximum of $15 per person per year, but stressed that they were to secure the treaty on much more favorable grounds. The official offer by the government was laid out like this, quote, "I will give you lands for farms and also reserves for your own use. It may be a long time before the other lands are wanted, and in the meantime you will be permitted to fish and hunt over them. I will also establish schools whenever any band asks for them, so that your children may have the learning of the white man. I will give you $10 per head of the population, and for every other year, $5 a head. But to the chief men, not exceeding 2 to each band, we will give $20 a year forever. I will give to each of you this year a present of goods and provisions to take you home, and I am sure you will be satisfied. End quote. After contemplating the offer for one day, the main spokesperson, since the Anishinaabe never had like a main, so they kind of just elected this person amongst themselves for this specific thing, which also was not going with what their tradition culture was. So that was already a really colonial thing to have like one person speak for everybody and not get like every single person's input at the table. So after contemplating the offer for one day, the main spokesperson for the Anishinaabe presented his people's terms. He emphasized, however, that this was for the use of their land, not the ownership. As he told the agents, all this is our property where you have come. The Anishinaabe of the region were aware of how the other indigenous lands or the other indigenous nations had been taken advantage of and were rightfully defensive. The revised deal ended up being an increase of the signing bonus from $10 to $12 per year and would include farming or funding for farming tools and weapons. The Anishinaabe also pushed for exclusion from conscription, having fought many colonial wars, and permission to hunt and fish on reserve lands. They asked whether the Métis could be recognized in this treaty as well, to which the agent denied. Again, even through the 4 years of negotiations, there were outside promises, including the exclusion of conscription and the right to mine for minerals, which have never been resolved to this day. Treaty 3 went on to serve as the model for many of the remaining future treaties. Now back to the scandal on Parliament Hill. On November 3rd, 1873, MacDonald gave a 5-hour speech beginning at 9 p.m. So he spoke from 9 to 2 a.m. Please, I don't think I would have sat there. Denying all accusations, stating such contributions were common for political parties. In 1873, political parties were getting millions of dollars. Okay. On November 5th, after pressure both in the Commons as well as from the public, MacDonald finally resigned. However, the Conservative Party refused his resignation as their party leader. They're like, this is the cash cow man. He finds a way. Let's keep him on. The Liberal leader, Alexander Mackenzie, became the second prime minister. Alexander Mackenzie was in office from 1873 to 1878. During his single term in office, he established the Supreme Court of Canada and oversaw the completion of the Parliament buildings. He also introduced the secret ballot. Before this, the white land-owning elites with the right to vote would enter into a single room and verbally cast their votes to be counted. This led to brawls, intimidation, blackmailing, and vote buying. I wonder if John A. Macdonald truly had the majority vote. With Mackenzie in office, the Indian Act was passed, and there were additional 4 treaties signed. Treaty 4 was signed on September 15th, 1874 by the Nehiyawak and Anishinaabe peoples of southern Saskatchewan. Treaty 4 is directly west of Treaty 2 and spreads to just past the eastern Alberta border. These treaty negotiations got off to a very rocky start. When the Indian agents arrived, more than half the population was away buffalo hunting. When the Nehiyawak arrived back, the Anishinaabe sent word they would only speak at their own camps. The agents attempted to refuse, but the Anishinaabe said they would not meet where the colonizers were, as they had chosen an HBC post. And the HBC had already stolen this land in the past, leading to the treaty. Seeking peace, the agents rightfully moved closer to the camp. Although there were some disagreements, the leaders were willing to accept the same terms offered in Treaty 3 with an inclusion of a monetary allowance of $750 a year for ammo, bales, and fishing net twine. The changes to the annual payments was an increase to $5 per person per year. Each family of five was to receive 640 acres or 1 square mile of land, which could be sold back to the government for compensation. On April 30th, 1875, treaties 1, 2, and 3 were amended to add the increase to the $5 annual payment, as well as added the outside promises, although these were not met immediately, if at all. Treaty 5 was signed on September 20th, 1875, after the Anishinaabe and Nehiyawak peoples of Treaty 5 was signed on September 20th, 1875, by the Anishinaabe and Nehiyawak peoples of central Manitoba. After hearing of the first 4 treaties signed, the nations demanded the government provide similar assistance on their territories. Some of their communities were suffering from starvation, as the lands were not suitable for farming, and the buffalo hunt was not giving them the sustenance they relied on anymore due to the genocidal overhunting. The government, however, only wanted to acquire the land along Lake Winnipeg so they could settle it and then use it for resource extraction. The government was uninterested in the poor agricultural and settlement potential in northern Manitoba, resulting in the northern section of the province being left out of the initial signing. One exception was made for the starving community of Norway House, which was included. The treaty terms were a mix of all 4 treaties before it. The lands in that region were not considered as valuable, and thus they were only given a one-time payment of $5 as opposed to the 12 in Treaties 3 and 4. In addition, Treaty 5 peoples would only receive 160 acres of land per family of 5, the same amount on Treaties 1 and 2. Their monetary allowance was $300 a year. On April 12th, 1876, the Indian Act became law and is still in law today. The Indian Act is a topic that deserves its own episode, so the Coles Notes version is this. It defines who is and who is not recognized as an Indian and what rights they have. Indian agents were responsible for implementing government policy on reserves, enforced the Indian Act, and managed the day-to-day affairs of the people. This included signing passes needed to leave the reserves. In mixed marriages, status now went by the father as a way to assimilate more people into whiteness, as Métis and non-status would have been more likely to have had an Indigenous mother. Indigenous women who married a colonizer lost their status. Later, to gain voting rights, Indigenous men had to give up their status and live off reserve. The pass system was implemented with the Indian Act, giving the local Indian agents the powers of a justice of the peace. Through this apartheid system, Indigenous people could not leave a reserve without risking imprisonment unless they had a signed pass, and this was enforced by the Northwest and Mountain Police, primarily in Alberta and the Prairie Treaties. Federal officials rationalized that quote, Indians have to be kept separate from the rest of society for their own good, as contact tends to be injurious to them, unquote. Only months later, Treaty 6 was signed on August 28, 1876, by Nehiyawak tribes spanning central Saskatchewan and Alberta. The Nehiyawak people made it clear that they would not tolerate any trespassers on their land without compensation, stopping surveyors and telegraph workers from moving through their territory. Before negotiations began, the Nehiyawak performed a sacred pipe ceremony. Historians have argued that this was extremely significant because it invited the Creator to provide guidance and to witness. By participating, the Indian agents were taking an oath to be truthful during the proceedings, and the Nehiyawak went into negotiations with this understanding. The agent explained to the group that the Crown would create reserves for them and assist them in farming without interfering with their present mode of living. However, the concept of land ownership was never explicitly discussed. They couldn't understand how the government would give them land they already possessed. The agent pressured the negotiations by telling them they would find themselves soon overcrowded by settlers with no lands for themselves unless they moved on to reserves. The days of the buffalo hunt were coming to an end, and as such it seemed like the best option. 3 new terms were included in this treaty: the storage of a medicine chest at the local Indian agent's house, additional agricultural implements, and a famine and pestilence clause, which promised to protect the indigenous from such problems. Their annual allowance for goods was $1,500. Treaty 7 was signed on September 22nd, 1877 by the Niitsitapi, Tsuut'ina, and Nakota peoples in southern Alberta. The Indigenous peoples had a much different understanding of what the treaty would entail and understood it to be the aid to ending the trespassing that had been happening on their land in exchange for a series of promises. None thought it was a land surrender. Each group received reserve lands allowing for 640 acres per family of 5. An immediate payment of $12 was given to every person. Their annual allowance as a nation as a whole was $2,000. Each family was also given cattle in proportion to their size, 2 for a family of 5, 3 for any larger, as well as the chiefs being promised 1 bull. The treaty did not have the effect the Indigenous peoples had sought for. The Nehiyawak and Métis hunters were still trespassing, and settlers continued to arrive. The reserve land given was unsuitable for agricultural practices. Only 2 years after the treaty was signed, a local Catholic priest who had actually encouraged the Indigenous people to sign described in a letter, quote, "I have never seen them so depressed as they are now. I have never seen them before in want of food. They have suffered fearfully from hunger," unquote, and argued that, quote, "As to the question of whether they understood the real nature of the treaty, my answer to this question is unhesitatingly negative," unquote. This was the last treaty signed for 22 years, and with these 7 treaties, the government had underhandedly stolen almost the whole southern strip of Western Canada, spanning from Western Ontario across to the Alberta-BC border. In 1878, John A. Macdonald won another majority government and continued to hold the majority governments through the next 4 elections. In January 1879, Macdonald commissioned a report regarding the industrial boarding school system in the U.S. The Report on Industrial Schools for Indians and Half-Breeds was submitted to Ottawa a few months later, providing the blueprint for the Canadian federally funded residential school system. It called for cooperative efforts between the federal government and the various churches to implement the, quote, "aggressive assimilation," unquote. To convince Parliament of the necessity for residential schools in 1879, John A. Macdonald is quoted. "When the school is on the reserve, the child lives with its parents, who are savages, and though he may learn to read and write, his habits and training mode of thoughts are Indian. He is simply a savage who can read and write. It has been strongly impressed upon myself that Indian children should be withdrawn as much as possible from the parental influence, and the only way to do that would be to put them in central training schools where they will acquire the habits and modes and thoughts of white men," end quote. The Department of Indian Affairs, DIA, was officially created in 1880. However, the British Crown had established the Indian Department in 1755. The DIA was and still is responsible for the development of policies related to Indigenous peoples. The department was divided into an outside and inside services. The inside services were the officers at headquarters in Ottawa. The outside services consisted of the many Indian agents and other employees across the country who dealt directly with Indigenous peoples. While the DIA was responsible for holding reserve lands in trust, this directly contradicts its role to settle the West. This meant large amounts of reserve lands were surrendered for white settlement. In 1880, the Canadian Pacific Railway construction finally slowly began and was so costly that the project almost went bankrupt before being completed 5 years later. One of the major issues with the railway was crossing the Rocky Mountains in order to get to British Columbia. Once a pass was discovered, the BC government hired 17,000 Chinese immigrants to work alongside navvies, short for navigator, their European counterparts. A navvy received $1 to $2.50 per day, paying for their own food and transport to the site. After 2.5 months, they could net as little as $16 after expenses. The Chinese immigrants, however, were paid 75 cents per day in rice, not real dollars, not including expenses, leaving them absolutely $0 to send home. They did the most dangerous jobs, such as using dynamite to clear tunnels through the mountain. Many Chinese immigrants died during the building of the railway, and their bodies were buried into the railway itself. The families received no compensation or even notification. The men who survived did not have enough money to return home to China, although the contractors had promised that as part of their responsibilities. Boys as young as 12 worked in this industry. During the building of the railway, the contractors had to pay $1 million in bribes to ensure government support, including £40,000 for a necklace for Lady Macdonald. In 1883, Parliament approved $43,000 for a fully federally funded school, and the first of this kind, Battleford Industrial School, opened in Saskatchewan on December 1st that year. 2 years later, the students were taken on a field trip to witness the hanging of 8 Indigenous men convicted of an uprising, the Battle of Batoche. By 1900, 17 years later, there would be 61 residential schools in operation in almost every single province. In 1884, Louis Riel was called upon by Métis leaders in Saskatchewan to help resolve grievances with the federal government. This led to his second resistance movement and his return to Canada. He was defeated at the Battle of Batoche and imprisoned before being tried for high treason and executed by hanging at the age of 41 on November 16th, 1885, in front of residential school children. John A. Macdonald had this to say about the event, quote, "He shall die though every dog in Quebec bark in his favor," end quote. In 1885, the Government of Canada banned the practice of potlatch. Potlatch was the event of feasting, gift-giving, and dancing that many nations in the Pacific Northwest practiced. Families would gather for celebration or mourning, and the family who called for the potlatch was expected to feed all those who came and give high-valued gifts. This was a way to spread wealth throughout Indigenous communities. The colonizers, in their Eurocentric, selfish ways, could not comprehend giving away nearly all of one's hard-earned possessions and took it as a sign that the Indigenous peoples were, quote, unstable, unquote. It dramatically opposed the values of the ideal Christian capitalist society. It became a misdemeanor to attend a potlatch and could result in up to 3 months of jail time for offenders. In 1885, John A. Macdonald is quoted in Parliament after the Northwest Rebellion, which included, I believe, the Battle of Batoche. "We have had a wonderful success, but still we have had the Indians, and then in these half-breeds, enticed by white men, the savage instinct was awakened, the desire of plunder, aye, and perhaps the desire of scalping. The savage idea of a warlike glory was aroused in them, and forgetting all the kindness that had been bestowed upon them, forgetting all the gifts that had been given to them, forgetting all that the government, the white people, and the Parliament of Canada had been doing for them in trying to rescue them from barbarity, forgetting that we had given them reserves, the means to cultivate those reserves, and the means of education, how to cultivate them. Forgetting all these things, they rose against us. I have not hesitated to tell this House again and again that we could not always hope to maintain peace with the Indians, that the savage was still a savage. We were always in danger of a collision, in danger of war, in danger of outbreak. End quote. The same year that the railway was completed, 1885, Canada passed the Chinese Immigration Act. This placed a head tax of $50 on all Chinese immigrants entering the country. Due to the railway being completed, the demand for Chinese immigration decreased significantly, and this was a rise in the fear Due to the railway being completed, the demand for Chinese immigration decreased significantly, and there was a rise in the fear that immigrants would take jobs from Canadians. Of course, these are the good jobs that Canadians actually want, so you can have them. Blowing up some of our goddamn mountains so colonizers can cross stolen land? That's all yours. I think it's also important to remember that after the job was done, we did not provide these Chinese workers a way home, thus increasing the odds that their family would move to Canada and have to pay $50 per person to enter. The only exceptions to the head tax were short-term Chinese immigrants who would eventually be going back to China, such as students, diplomats, and tourists. Oh, and let's take inflation into account again, shall we? $50 in 1885, $1,583 in 2024. John A. Macdonald told the House of Commons that if the British John A. Macdonald told the House of Commons that if, quote, the Chinese are not excluded from Canada, the Aryan character of the future of British America will be destroyed, end quote. Who does that sound like? In May 1891, John A. Macdonald suffered a stroke, which left him paralyzed and unable to speak. Cricket, 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 cricket. A month later, he went straight to hell. During his second stint in office, he oversaw 21 additional residential schools being built. The legacy we remember today resulted in his face being taken off the $10 bill, his name being phased out of many roadways, and his statues being vandalized or removed. However, it wasn't always this way. In polls over the years, John A. Macdonald was consistently rated as one of the best Canadians in history until 2018. Upon his death, Conservative John Abbott succeeded as third Prime Minister, becoming the first Prime Minister born in Canada. Due to his poor health, however, he was in power for just over 1 year, from 1891 to 1892. After Abbott retired, the Conservative John Thompson, a Catholic, took office. He had been unwilling to succeed after Macdonald's death, as he worried there would be prejudice from the Crown over his faith. However, he needn't have worried, for just over 2 years later, in 1894, he would die of a heart attack at the young age of 49. Before his death, he oversaw 10 new residential school openings. Good riddance. Conservative Mackenzie Bowell was a newspaper publisher turned politician who only lasted until 1896. Previously, Manitoba had abolished public provincial funding for Catholic and Protestant schools. Bowell was indecisive on his decision, and being so close to another being so close to another election, several members of cabinet forced him to resign. Conservative Dr. Charles Tupper is Conservative Dr. Charles Tupper is Canada's shortest serving Prime Minister, holding office for a total of 68 days as a de facto PM. When Bao was still legally the Prime Minister, Tupper was the new leader of the party. He resigned when the Conservatives lost the election to the Liberals and is the only medical doctor to have held office for, once again, 68 days. In 1896, the 7th Prime Minister, went through 4 Prime Ministers like lickety-split there. In 1896, the 7th Prime Minister, Wilfrid Laurier, won the election, marking a Liberal win for the first time in 18 years. He was the first French-Canadian Prime Minister, and his 45 years of service in the House of Commons is a record in Canadian history. That's crazy. 45 years serving in the House of Commons? That is wild. That's almost as long as that one Prime Minister lived for. In his early years in office, he focused on domestic policy, like pumping out residential schools in quantities that MacDonald would have even envied. In 1898, the Yukon separated from the Northwest Territories, becoming the second territory to enter Confederation, and Quebec was enlarged, expanding further north closer to its modern boundaries. Treaty 8 was signed on June 21st, 1899 by the Tetsikane Deneza Nahiawak Saulteaux in northern Alberta, northern BC, and parts of Saskatchewan Northwest Territories. Treaty 8 is the largest treaty by area at almost 850,000 square kilometers and marks the western boundary of the general treaty lands. This treaty, as first presented, was immediately rejected. The agents were mocked for using the Prairie Nations as a reference to what was needed in this much more northern territory. The reserves were to be granted in 640-acre increments per family of 5. However, due to the social structures of northern peoples, they lived in smaller groups, to which they were granted 160 acres of land off reserve instead. In 1900, Laurier raised the Chinese head tax to $100. $3,655 today, and in 1903 he raised it further to $500, which is $18,277 just to get into Canada, just because you're Chinese. Holy. When a few Chinese immigrants were able to pay this inflated tax, he proposed raising the sum to 1,000. He also negotiated a limit to Japanese immigration to Canada. This guy was just a racist. Treaty 9 was signed on July 12, 1905 by the Anishinaabe and Nahiawak of Northern Ontario. No further treaties were created farther east, marking this as the eastern boundary. This treaty is known as the James Bay Treaty, as the federal and provincial governments were both interested in the Hudson and James Bay watersheds, and the governments negotiated the terms of the treaty amongst themselves. The Nahiawak and Anishinaabe peoples of this region were not involved in the writing of the treaty, nor were they permitted to make any changes. What kind of treaty is that? Reserve lands were set aside at 640 acres per family of 5. However, they would receive compensation at the government's discretion if the lands were needed for public works projects. Again, at the government's discretion. On September 1st, 1905, Laurier oversaw Saskatchewan and Alberta's entry into Confederation, the last 2 provinces to be created out of the Northwest Territories, and the 8th and 9th provinces overall. The full treaty was signed in multiple stages by different nations. This treaty was signed rather uneventfully. The full treaty was signed in multiple stages by different nations. This treaty was signed rather uneventfully, as the treaty-related discussions had developed a familiar pattern with which the agents were prepared to hurry along. No agricultural assistance or allowance was provided. This was now a well-oiled system for the government, and no negotiations were had. Due to the initial signing, the other nations who were visited in the coming year signed without worry. On September 1st, 1905, Laurier oversaw Saskatchewan and Alberta's entry into Confederation, the last two provinces to be created out of the Northwest Territories, and the 8th and 9th provinces overall. Immigration from Europe dramatically increased in the beginning of the 20th century. Laurier's immigration policy targeted the prairies, where farming production could be increased. The BC government was alarmed at the arrival of people they considered uncivilized and wanted the cheap labor and adopted a whites-only immigration policy. While the railway companies wanted the cheap labor of Asian immigrants, labor unions and the public were opposed. Laurier, being a racist, was more than happy to stand behind public opinion on this. Treaty 10 was signed on August 28th, 1906, by the Dene and Nehiyawak in northern Saskatchewan. The people of this region had already requested the signing of a treaty in 1879 due to food scarcity, which the government had declined because they had a need for the land at the time. I think I see a pattern emerging. The government decided to use Treaty 8 as the model for this one, as the northern people were most likely already familiar with those terms. Lands off reserve were offered by those who wanted it, and the government offered assistance in both education and agricultural, but in terms less clear than other treaties. By this time, Laurier had converted the Liberal Party into a strong French party due to the links with anti-French, anti-Catholic supporters within the Conservative Party. However, Catholic priests in Quebec warned parishioners not to vote Liberal, using the slogan Le ciel est bleu, l'enfer est rouge, meaning heaven is blue, hell is red, referring to the traditional conservative liberal colors. Laurier has a long, disgusting history of his racist views and actions. In August 1911, he approved the Order in Council PC 1911-1324. In August 1911, he approved the Order in Council PC 1911-1324, which was intended to keep Black Americans escaping segregation out of Canada, stating that the Negro race is deemed unsuitable to the climate and requirements of Canada. The order was never called upon, as immigration efforts had already reduced the number of Black Americans migrating to Canada. The order was cancelled the day before Laurier left office, coincidentally, by cabinet claiming the minister had not been present at the time of approval. Laurier ended up losing the faith of the public and in 1911 lost the election to the Conservative leader. This ended Laurier and the Liberals' 15 years of rule, marking Laurier as Canada's longest consecutive Prime Minister. At the end of his tenure, 28 residential schools had been opened under his watch, and Treaties 8, 9, and 10 were signed. At the beginning of World War I, Canada had approximately 75 federally funded residential schools. Duncan Campbell Scott, who would become Canada's Indian Affairs Deputy Superintendent, wrote on April 12, 1910, quote, "It is readily acknowledged that Indian children lose their natural resistance to illness by habitating so closely in these schools, and that they die at a much higher rate than in their own villages. But this alone does not justify a change in the policy of this department, which is geared towards the final solution of our Indian problem." End quote. As always, thank you for joining me today. I drop a new episode every Monday morning at midnight, MST. So check back in next week to see what I'll be sharing with you then. If you or a loved one you know uses drugs, please keep in mind that you can call 1-888-688-6677 to contact the National Overdose Response Services to access support while using and especially using alone. And there's the Brave app with a use alone timer that connects you to a paramedic if you don't respond. Everyone, please consider picking up a free naloxone kit and keep it on hand 24/7. If you're unaware of where to pick up a kit, simply Google naloxone kit plus your province. If you learned something new today, it'd be awesome if you'd click that button and follow along for next time. Or if you'd like to contact me with feedback, you can email me at oursharedpodcast@gmail.com. Have a good one.